and I work for the Housing First National Office. I'm delighted to welcome everybody here this afternoon on behalf of the Housing Agency, and we're delighted to be hosting our fourth and final webinar in this trauma-informed care series. This webinar is entitled Vicarious Trauma, which is self-care for practitioners. And we're delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Briege Casey and Gary Broderick, who are going to be delivering the presentations and hopefully entering into some conversation on this very important topic. We'll also be hearing from Bob Jordan, the Chief Executive of the Housing Agency, with some concluding remarks at the end of the webinar. So Dr. Briege Casey is an Associate Professor at the School of Nursing, Psychotherapy and Community Health at DCU. She's worked in areas of mental health, addiction and homelessness for over 30 years as a mental health nurse and an academic in both Ireland and the UK. She's Programme Coordinator for the Undergraduate Certificate in Homeless Prevention and Intervention at DCU, which is a course developed in partnership with major stakeholders in the homeless sector to address the educational skills needs of key workers in Irish homeless services. Gary Broderick is the CEO of the SAOL Project, and he's also worked in the addiction services field for over 30 years. Gary teaches on the social work courses in UCD and Maynooth University on addiction and trauma-informed practice. He's a strong advocate for the peer voice and recognition of gender differences associated with both addiction and mental health, and he's currently a doctoral student in social policy at Maynooth University. So I'd just like to remind everybody this afternoon that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared in due course on the Housing Agency YouTube channel. We'd also like to encourage any questions that you might have into the chat facility, and we'll hopefully address these at the end of the session. And without further ado, I'll invite Gary and Briege to go ahead with your presentations.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Grania. It's great to be here. We've been working on this area for some time, as you'd imagine, and it's brilliant at this stage in the series that we have the opportunity today to really focus on a practitioner, because that's a huge part. If we don't have practitioners who are trauma-informed and able to look after themselves, then we can't address any form of trauma with our clients. So we thought whenever we're doing the presentation today that we worked on it together, and that we just talk to each slide and we can work in a conversational kind of way, and so we just move forward with that. And really we're hoping to talk a bit about vicarious trauma, what that actually means, and some related concepts, and then move forward into looking at what is expected of practitioners in this whole area of care, things like emotional labour, and then look at the role of the organisation in helping people to manage vicarious trauma, and also some care that practitioners can use for themselves.
And we kind of thought, though, that we would begin with resilience, because resilience is kind of that time of that ability to respond to, and despite all these things that we're caught up with, being able to have the capacity to cope. And just to recognize that even though we're focusing on maybe in our talk today some of the more negative sides of the impact of vicarious trauma, just remembering that we have resiliences and we build up a backbone and a strength and such like. But nonetheless, we need to be aware. So just to be clued in, and we were playing with a picture below, and part of our own resiliency is to have our community around us, be that the people that we work with, but also outside of work, and having those kind of connections and support. And I suppose just one last thing that we were talking about before we started was just knowing how to ask for help, but also knowing how to say to somebody that maybe the environment or the trauma that's around them may be impacting on them and they're not noticing. But these are the kind of languages that we'll be talking about. So over to you, Briege, and we'll talk straight in on the emotional work that we're doing.
Yeah, and really, I suppose, often as practitioners, we feel that we can move forward, that nothing touches us, that it's our job to constantly be there, be all things to all people, and that somehow we are untouched by all of these experiences. So I suppose we just really wanted to remind people that, you know, this notion that we can be immersed in, you know, trauma and challenges in our work and not be untouched by it is quite an unrealistic notion, really. So I think that we just wanted to conjure that up in a visual way as well as a verbal way.
I like the way that it's just about getting wet, not getting drenched.
Yeah.
So we try and avoid that bit.
Yeah. Do you want to?
No, you can keep
Yeah.
going.
Thanks, Gary. So yeah, so basically, you know, some of the discourses that are around help to really sustain those kind of notions that we should be invincible. You know, for example, the context, you know, that we're socially, I mean, you only have to look at COVID-19, you know, that health and social care practitioners are seen as, you know, we should just be there, caring, self-sacrificing, and also like as heroes, you know, that we carry on no matter what, and without regard really for our own health. And those kind of discourses, even though we might know them to be unrealistic, sometimes we absorb those kind of discourses into our own self-beliefs. And we focus more on service users than actually reflecting on ourselves. Somehow it's not the thing to do to actually accept that we're human.
And I think that that's why the term vicarious trauma is useful, because what it's saying is that when we're working with people who have been through trauma, some of that is going to stick to us. And if we wait for the big breakdown by not looking after ourselves, then that's when we get seriously damaged by the environment within which we're working. Whereas if we are more aware right from the get-go and building into our own practice of care of me, then I can make sure that the environment that I'm working in and the expectations that are surrounding me don't get to be the loudest voice in the discourse, that we're actually able to kind of say, actually, I need to look after myself in doing this. And I liken it a lot of the time to, if you speak to a carpenter, you know, they're going to have got splinters from their work. There are splinters in our emotional work that we do. And once we attend to those splinters, they don't get septic, you know, but if we're not attending to them, then they start making a lot more trouble for us. Yeah.
Okay.
So I suppose within that, then there are different types of trauma that we might meet. And I suppose most of us are drawn to the helping profession because we care about people. And sometimes that may come from our own past experiences of trauma. Maybe we just understand it better than most. And if we're bringing trauma, and most of us will be from our past, there will be times that the people that we meet to work with will trigger some of those traumas. There might then be direct exposure to trauma. That's where I'm meeting it because of the complexity of the work that we're doing. So things like self-harm or suicidal ideation or even suicide, overdoses, violence, aggression, domestic violence, that we meet that on a day-to-day basis. And I suppose it is all of those things and how that affects us. We might not be experiencing the events that the people we're working with have experienced, but some of what they do stick to us. And here's a big kind of picture with lots of words. You might reflect on it later, but it comes from Wendy Ellis's work, where she was trying to kind of highlight that not only are there traumas, and she was particularly linking trauma with the ACEs study and the kind of the experiences that childhood trauma brings, things like emotional and physical neglect, mental health, sexual, physical, emotional abuse, and so on. But what she was always saying, that may be the branches and the leaves on the tree, but that it's also important that we recognize the environment within which people are living and working, and sometimes the environments that we're living and working in. So we might be working in poorer, more discriminated, more violent communities, but we may also be living in those communities, and that the experience of a trauma combined with the environment makes that much more complex, much more difficult. But it is that we don't just look at the individual as, oh, there's a traumatized individual and we're working with them. Sometimes the individual is coming in with no control over the trauma they've experienced, because it's much more systemic. It's much more in the environment within which they work. And coupled with that, I kind of took Wendy Ellis's tree and I took all the words off just to leave the adverse trauma experiences and then the adverse community environments, but then just wanted to add it in, if it'll work. Oh, it's decided not to show up for me. Oh, there it is. The political environment within which, and by political, I'm kind of using that broad sense of what's the discourse that's happening in our kind of society at the moment. And there is that sense through neoliberalism or capitalism or business-oriented push that really get on with it. And that is both for the worker and for the person attending services. So maybe sometimes that puts an extra pressure, and that's where, even with the term self-care, there's almost a hint in that this all falls on you to look after yourself, when really what we'll be talking about as this session goes on is that there's a responsibility, yes, for our own input into our own care, but also for the people that we're working with and for.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's that thing of, you know, managing or working with our own emotions as we encounter all sorts of different traumas, and also you know, really looking after ourselves. It's that thing of, yes, you know, entering the stream or the river with people, getting wet, but not getting totally saturated that we're drowning. So it's just
Sorry.
yeah,
I'm failing badly at getting the slides here.
yeah. So yeah, so when we were thinking about some of that work-related trauma, you know, whether it's direct or indirect trauma, we're thinking about what impacts that has on practitioners and people working in the sector. So we thought that some of the negative effects, and through the literature that we reviewed as well, vicarious traumatization, which we'll be talking more about today, secondary traumatic stress, which is very like vicarious traumatization, and then compassion fatigue as well. Then we have the neutral effects, where, you know, the impact of trauma is managed effectively. And then there's the positive effects, which include, you know, post-traumatic growth, vicarious resilience, and vicarious transformation. And that is where the effects of the actual trauma, of actually dealing with it within that struggle within ourselves, brings about positive growth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on.
And I suppose we were also saying that, you know, the terms vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, there isn't a universal agreement on what they mean. So we'll present to you what we're thinking about it, but sometimes those terms are interchangeable, and they, you know, they might connect differently with you. But also to note, again, with the resilience piece, that when we experience something difficult at work, or a really difficult case is presented, that from that, maybe sometimes we can become better workers, that we understand things a lot more deeply. So there is that post-trauma growth element that is worth noting. It's not all one direction, if you like.
So looking at vicarious trauma, really, this is some of what has been said, let's say, about vicarious trauma in the literature. And a lot of the definitions position it as a kind of personal transformation that comes over as a result of engaging empathically, which we do routinely in care of others, and especially in relation to other people's traumatic experiences. So it's that getting into the water, if you like, with people. As a result of that, we engage our own empathic selves And that can result in change. It can distort our own worldview of ourselves, especially if the trauma is particularly severe, or as Gary mentioned, is triggering to ourselves. And so it can affect us psychologically and emotionally, in quite a powerful way. And as a result, some people find that their sense of trust and safety, their control or their self-esteem is affected by that process, because it can be quite destabilizing to listen to and be witness to, sometimes even at handovers. Hearing the experiences that people have gone through can be quite traumatic.
And I think with that as well, it's the big issues, when something big happens in work, we kind of notice those and we almost protect ourselves, put on your overcoat, protect against the storm. But it's the daily kind of sandpaper effect.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're realizing that maybe this is impacted. So we don't always have words for it. We don't always name it. And that's where paying attention to, how am I in my work? How is this work impacting on me? How am I seeing the world? It might be after a few years, you're suddenly realizing, gosh, I'm much more pessimistic or negative in my outlook than I used to be. What's happened there? And maybe I hadn't been watching. So that awareness of how am I in my work becomes really, really important. And the earlier we start this, the better. I mean, speaking as an ancient person at this stage, it's one that you need to start early on. But I often find with younger workers, they don't even see. They can take on anything. They take on the world, so they don't notice this slow kind of erosion kind of thing that happens. So sometimes it requires the more mature members of the team to be encouraging this as a practice within a team.
Okay, so as we were saying earlier, this can lead to a decreased engagement and that therapeutic response, which is so important in working with clients. And I think that sadly, this can happen, that the practitioner can withdraw more and to deny or invalidate patients' or client experiences. And often we hear people talking about that, becoming cynical, becoming suspicious, maybe a bit judgmental. Oh, I've seen it all before. And that comes through just the sandpaper effect of vicarious trauma over a particular length of time. And of course, that has huge organizational impacts. And we are talking here as well about the cost of vicarious trauma on staff, and that happens with decreased work performance and decision making, because if your energy is low and you're preoccupied with other things, your ability to make decisions does suffer. And then you have things like sick leave, safety compromised, and job stress on an ongoing basis.
None of which is good for the team or for the organization in providing the services. So this isn't just an individual experience. It can domino effect throughout.
Yeah, and then there's some of the terms that are very like vicarious trauma. So we're not going to labor this, but just that you would be aware of. Sometimes people use the term vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress interchangeably, and you can read that there yourselves. But I suppose what some of the literature seems to say is that the secondary traumatic stress, it can happen after single interpersonal interaction, whereas vicarious trauma is more seen as a longer process. Now, you might argue with that. You might say it could happen the other way around, but just in terms of what has been written about it, really.
But I think a team or an organization that is aware of vicarious trauma is better able to handle that single big event, because they're clued into how that might impact. And I suppose to note when something really bad happens that really impacts a team, having those resources in place to respond very quickly is so important. I'm just thinking, I'm remembering a really bad thing that happened about 8 years ago in our organization, and just the impact on the team. And we were fortunate that we had access to the supports to make that. But still, years on, people still refer back to that event. You know, it really impacts. But I suppose really that's the one that's there. Maybe that's the one that would get the reaction from an organization anyway. Whereas vicarious trauma is just recognizing that, you know, the regular impact of the work that we do, the emotional labor that we're doing. I'm failing badly with this, aren't I? With the changing slides.
You're doing great, Gary.
I don't know what's happening here. It's not, hang on, I'll do it that way.
Okay.
Do you want to spend time on compassion fatigue?
Yeah, I mean, you know, similarly, we saw, I suppose, compassion fatigue as a more chronic, let's say, you know, that just from giving. It may not necessarily be that there's a load of trauma happening, but that when you're constantly caring and you're constantly on as such, and you're giving of your best and you're giving compassion all the time, you know, whether there's trauma there or not, it eventually does wear us down a bit. And I think it's really important that we are aware of that. It has links with burnout, which we'll talk about now. It's just fatigue. We get tired.
Yeah.
We're human.
How do we notice it and how do we say it to each other is important.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about burnout, seeing as you're a burnt out old man?
Yeah, well, there we are. I'm just looking for my picture. I'm going to talk about it not through the slide here, but more through the image.
Yes.
As a burnt out old man. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I shall hold that deeply. I like the image of the match because you have the match at the very start, and this is the skill set that you bring to your organization and your work, and then the work begins to impact. And it's kind of okay that the work begins to impact, but you'll notice that these matches are gradually getting burned out. And when we get to the very end, the thing is that really you've changed from being a piece of wood there.
Thanks.
To being a lump of charcoal.
Oh, thanks.
And just, you know, any chemists among us will know that they are different compounds. In other words, the image really being that maybe I've become a different person, and maybe this new person that I am is no longer able to do the emotional work that I was doing. Now, sometimes I stay in the job and that becomes very unhelpful, but maybe as burnout continues, it really leads to a place of nobody benefits. The organization doesn't benefit, the worker doesn't benefit, and the client doesn't benefit because the worker is no longer able to do that work. So that's, you know, I see burnout as a really very severe part of this journey. And whilst vicarious trauma is around, it doesn't necessarily lead to burnout. But if we care for ourselves, if we have strategies in place, then there's no reason for us to become the burned out old shell of a man that I am at this point.
Okay, so there's quite a lot. I mean, when we say risk factors for vicarious trauma, it makes it sound very clinical, but I mean, we know, I think what we mean by that. It's just things that are around that are going to kind of further, let's say, the effects or deepen the effects of vicarious trauma. And, you know, again, it's probably quite arbitrary, but we've split it into personal and professional. And obviously they overlap. And you can see there yourselves, you know, Gary has mentioned that the personal history of trauma, you know, whether that's resolved or unresolved, it's there. I mean, it's like the body keeps the score in terms of trauma, and it can be reactivated. And if we have pre-existing mental health issues, sometimes younger people as well are very open. They mightn't have mastered the same sort of ego defenses that some, you know, older people might have. Your support system, having losses in your lives already, which of course is a form of trauma also. And the level of exposure that we have to indirect trauma and even direct trauma is going to, in our current lives, is going to really impact that. And then balanced, I suppose, against that is, our level of self-efficacy, resilience we mentioned, and our coping mechanisms, and what we have in terms of meaning-making resources, whether that's a strong spiritual belief or, kind of personal, whatever kind of beliefs that we might have. That's really important. And our personal and professional support systems that we build around ourselves, not necessarily what the organization provides, but what efforts we make to actually pull those things around ourselves. Do you want to talk about the professional ones?
Yeah, I think what Alvarez is kind of highlighting for us is the environment within the workplace becomes really important as to a risk factor. So if we are meeting lots of trauma in our daily work, and that can be we can manage that better if we're in an empathetic environment, if we have a team that understands one another, if there's compassion almost written into the policies and procedures of the place that we're working. We can't avoid trauma coming into our services. In fact, in many ways, that's what we're there for. In SAOL, we work with women who use drugs. Trauma is an everyday occurrence, but it's then what's created around us to make it safer for us working there. So that kind of the empathic processes and compassion that we have in our work, in our daily timetable. What's the organizational expectations? How are the environments managed if they're very impoverished, even with something like getting a lick of paint in the place, or a comfortable place, or is there even a room for staff to go to, or are you constantly on the front line at work? So all of these kind of things. I'm also kind of aware of the pressures that come from the principles of capitalism and neoliberalism, and being able to show outcomes of work and the pressures that people are under for that, to prove cost of or the value for money and all this kind of thing. Because what that can do is forget that when people are coming in traumatized, that might be the work for a while, and then you're sitting there under pressure trying to manage that trauma, whilst then also saying, but I have to fill out these dozen different forms, and the person is unable to do that today. But then also, does the environment cater for you as the worker, who maybe are affected by the really difficult story that you've just heard, or just even the experience of being in the space with somebody who's distressed? So then looking to see what levels of caseload you're carrying, what breaks you have, what training is there. Are you coming with great experience or little experience? Is there supervision provided? And it might be that I'm the person who's on the desk doing doing all of the telephone calls coming in and out, and the people arriving at the door. I'm the first port of call, the gatekeeper for the organization. It might not automatically be presumed that I need supervision because it's not a clinical role, but actually I'm exposed to trauma, maybe even more so than some of the clinicians. So just looking at how we mind those people in the organization as well. And I suppose ultimately, do we feel valued in our organization? Do we feel that the changes in the way that things need to be done, or legislation, is that fitting in with a caring kind of environment? So that I as a worker feel respected and supported. And that's where, for a good vicariously trauma-informed organization, that it should be reflected in both HR and policies and documents and mission statement. All of that needs to be packaged together, if you like, to create an environment that's supportive of the worker.
Okay, so Gary's mentioned some of the interventions, let's say, or what needs to happen, and we'll be talking more about those later on. But the first step really is actually recognizing and addressing vicarious trauma in the first instance. And again, we have said earlier that this whole positioning of vicarious trauma as an individual issue, that this is something that is your problem, and you need to watch yourself and you need to sort yourself out. And if you are feeling overwhelmed, then go to staff counselling. You know, that's enough. We are saying that it, you know, fails to acknowledge both the really unconscious level of vicarious trauma in itself, and that people may not even recognize themselves that they are suffering from vicarious trauma. It might be a colleague that might notice it. You could notice it in somebody else. You could notice that maybe someone is changing at work. Maybe they're more tearful than they used to be. Maybe they avoid certain clients. Maybe they're more irritable. And so that may not always be put down to vicarious trauma. So it's not just about an individual issue. And to position it as an individual issue, it ignores the responsibility that the system or the organization has to actually, and as far as possible, I mean, we can't protect all staff from all harm, but as far as possible, to protect staff from the really negative effects of vicarious trauma, in as much as we can. So it's a dual kind of thing. It's both the self and also the organization. But sometimes the organization gets let off the hook, so to speak, in sort of the public view of it. And that, you know, the vicarious trauma is costly, and we want to really get that message across as well. When you think of people who are working under power, and we've mentioned the effects on the organization of, you know, the kind of decrease in efficiency, even if we want to look at it in neoliberal terms, and work performance and just basic feelings of contentment at work, that, you know, that's a big cost to the organization, and in terms of client care and all of that. So recognizing that this is a real thing, you know, vicarious trauma is a real thing, and that needs attention, not just, you know, when there's a suicide in the organization and everybody goes running and there's debriefing and there's you know, much more recognized procedures in place. But for the ongoing everyday trauma that people are experiencing silently and not bringing it to attention, that really needs to come to the foreground in all our planning. And that, you know, we talk a lot about trauma-informed organizations, but we need to think of vicarious trauma on staff and have that as part of trauma-informed care. And I know Gary's going to talk a little bit more about that later on.
Well, I just mentioned that now because if you know, when you look at the research, a trauma-informed organization and organizations that claim to be trauma-informed should be vicariously informed. That's naturally part of it. It's two sides of the one coin. But a lot of the time, the effort and energy goes into the care of the person using the service, and maybe to the expense of the person working in the service. And really, it's both and, not either or. And to my mind, it is actually less costly to implement vicarious trauma ideas and policies and practices with staff than it is to ignore, because you end up with workers who are out sick or less able to do the work, or maybe not able to carry your mission, you know, and your vision for what you were set up to do. We'll leave that one because we just mentioned it. Do you want to just talk to this one?
Yeah, so I mean, well, what does a vicarious trauma-informed organization look like? And I suppose we thought some of the qualities are here really. And it's this thing of having a strengths-based organizational culture and valuing of staff within the workplace. And we can say, oh yeah, that's all very well. A strengths-based is not, you know, picking out staff that you know are good at doing this, that, and the other, and then ignoring other staff that are sort of labeled as kind of more vulnerable and that they won't be able to do the job as well. It's about acknowledging the strengths in everybody, and everybody has different strengths, and valuing the staff, encouraging them, recognizing what they do well, when they cope well with different pressures, and supporting that whole process. Clear communication also about work roles and priorities, so that people are not feeling overwhelmed and burnt out. Leadership and the social support, the allocation of caseloads. And there's so many variables that come into caseloads that have to be balanced again with practitioner strengths, their needs and preferences. And, sometimes practitioners will have particular strengths and vulnerabilities at different times, maybe in their lives. It could be someone who has just had a bereavement, or there could be someone who's just feeling low power. Maybe they're anemic, maybe it could be physical, mental health issues. It could be particular clients, their issues or whatever that trigger certain things. So it's being as a sensitive manager to be able to see that, and to know your staff really well, and to know which kind of areas they are at their best in. So that's a really important one. So developing those policies as well on the prevention, response and support, and the clinical supervision, peer support and debriefing. And I think it's really important to emphasize that even for practitioners who don't personally seek it out, and that becomes a norm within the organization, that it's not just seen as somebody goes for psychological support when there is a problem. It's more about that this is part of, it's like healthy eating, it's like any of those things. This is part of good practice. And this is what helps with resilience and coping and all of those, rather than this is what you do when you have a problem.
Build up that muscle on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And it is even like that. I was struck by the word debriefing, and debriefing sometimes is after an incident, and debriefing can happen every day. You can just gather together for a few minutes before we all go home and just debrief, and how has the day been? Something as simple and straightforward as that. And then just reminding somebody, maybe bring that to your supervisor, explore that a little bit. And that's seen as a normal everyday thing, to be upset or kind of moved in a way that, I'm challenged a little bit or whatever by a case that we're working with is okay. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of actually insight and aware of what we want for the organizations that we're working with. Will we move on? I'm just conscious of the time. So maybe we're going to leave these to you to read yourselves. All of these slides will be available, and this is more just on those. But what we wanted to particularly just pay attention to was just the practical side of it. I had a lovely, there it is. Look, see, care of me. Self-care is the universal term. I was kind of looking for a slightly different term, which was basically saying this is a bit shared. It's not just all on me. So within that, a bit like what Briege was saying earlier, we as organizations and as managers need to provide supports for the staff. But we as staff need to recognize that not everything can be done by the organization that we work for. And we know that trauma and vicarious trauma, it goes in that kind of up and down kind of movement. Some days I'm particularly resilient, and then, given a particular episode in my own life, then I get impacted by my work differently, or as I begin to understand the work differently, or as I change roles, I begin to see it differently. So just being aware that I might need to invest in myself as well in looking after myself. So this diagram is really just to highlight that there are different areas to look after, and just notice in your own work, how are you physically, how is your own self-awareness, what's your own level of kindness both to yourself and to others? Do you have choices? How your attention is, your priorities, your curiosity and exploration. Do you attend to that at all? Or have you just become, I know everything, I don't do anything anymore? Who are your community? Do you slow down? Do you have pleasure in your life? Do you get support? Do you have acceptance? I often think back in the 90s, because I am that old man again, that we used to talk about William Glasser and choice theory. And it was, are you getting the different needs met in your life? And I remember with our client group, are you getting your fun needs met? And that was the one that they always fell down with, like the idea of paying attention to fun. But again, for ourselves as workers, it's so easy for us to stop looking after that part of our life. I'm too tired. I've got too much to do at home. I go home, sort out the family, go to bed, go to work. Go home, sort out the family, go to bed, go to work. There has to be other kind of pieces. And for that, then, I kind of just put this one together just to highlight that maybe if you looked at your own self-care in terms of 6 kind of areas, you see that she's doing her exercises and stretching here. So just looking at your own physical well-being and paying attention to that, but then also looking at your community. Who is your community? Who do you connect with? Do you pay attention to people other, or do you only ever meet people who work in the same job as you? And so that even when you're out socializing, that you're always talking about the work that you're doing. I hope that's not the case, but it can be the case. The not promoting yoga, but yoga can be a good way of both responding to the physical, but that sense of who am I in the world and why am I in the world and why am I doing this work?
Spirituality when it's looking at that one.
Yeah, and that's the exact category there of spirituality. So not necessarily religiosity, though if you are connected to religion, that's brilliant, but just who am I and why am I in the world and why am I doing the work that I'm doing? And just allowing that question to be there and exploring that and connecting yourself with it. Looking after your emotions, and it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be happy as well. And just checking in and, do you know how you're feeling today? Have you checked in with your emotions today? And also just looking at your brain, your cognition. Do you feed your brain with other things? Are you reading? Are you connecting? Are you thinking? Keeping yourself alive and well?
And I think in terms of brain thing as well, because one of the things that in the research that it says about vicarious trauma as well is that it affects your worldview and you become jaded and you get, particular views and, maybe stereotypes about people and ways of categorizing people, and that we challenge our cognitions and our assumptions at all times, I think is important.
And then the last one, while we still have a planet that we can go and visit, just to, we talk about grounding ourselves, but just to, when did you last ground yourself in nature and just to be in a different space and let the earth hold you, let the sea hold you, walk on the beach, get dirty, so that you're just in that different space. So in a sense, it's not just, when I say to people, how is your self-care? What do you do? And they say, oh, I walk the dog or I go to the gym and I have a bath. And they're all brilliant, but maybe we need more than that. Maybe we need to be thinking about a really holistic sense of what care I need, because if I'm working as a carpenter, I don't know why I'm picking on carpenters all the time, but carpenters, they sharpen their tools and they make sure that their tool bag is full of all the things that they need in order to do their work. And they're, reading the guiding lines and reading the whatever. You know, well, I wasn't a carpenter, wouldn't you? Anyway, but for ourselves, just, maybe I need more to be better able and to be a better worker. And where that's supported by our employers, that will hopefully make me a much better worker, that I'm much more rounded and available. Making it more complicated, I have this self-care wheel that you can take a look at, but it gives some practical examples of things you might like to do, as it's impossible for you to read that here. We'll leave it for the moment. But I go back, I work with people who use drugs, and they go to AA and NA, and one of the words that helps them is HALT, HALT, and it's really drawing attention to you're much more vulnerable to relapse if you don't pay attention to these 4 areas. And I then apply that across to self-care. So if you want to simplify self-care and the care of me down to 4 basics: hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. Am I eating properly and eating well, or am I overeating and overindulging and maybe not looking after my physical self well? How are my emotions? Am I angry all the time? Sometimes anger can be the easy way out, and I'm not really paying attention to what's going on for me. Who are my community? Am I connected or am I lonely? And sometimes when trauma and vicarious trauma is holding in, I limit my world. I start narrowing my world, so I'm not connecting with people because I don't have the energy anymore. And finally, that healing piece of sleeping. Am I tired all the time? And am I getting the hour sleep that I need? Am I getting the restfulness? Am I taking my annual leave? Am I actually leaving work behind, or am I answering emails at midnight? So how am I looking after my overall health and my sleep? We weren't sure whether we get to this. Maybe we'll quickly do it. Yeah.
And just to say, there's, we've concentrated on some of the self-care stuff as well, but there's also steps in some of those earlier slides in terms of what organizations can do and strategies in terms of managing, helping to work with practitioners and how practitioners themselves can work within organizations. And I think we had a conversation too that we felt sometimes plural managers get ignored as well, because we're saying, managers should look after staff and all of that. And it's a bit, I suppose, like the client and the key worker type relationship that, there's an expectation that managers can carry all this stuff. But really, we were saying that vicarious trauma, it really affects managers to a huge extent as well, because you're dealing with all the needs of staff. And if you're a good caring manager, people will be coming to you with all of these various issues and stuff. So you have this responsibility to, again, look after your own mental health, but also to be there for your staff and to be able to help to I wouldn't say mind them, but certainly help them to look after themselves and keep things on the road in a healthy, positive way. So that's a huge responsibility, and you're dealing with a lot of vicarious trauma within that. So I think that's really important there.
So it doesn't just stop at
Yeah.
the worker, and it doesn't just stop at the clinical worker either.
Yeah.
The security guards, the receptionist, the person working in the kitchen, they all need to be aware of how being in our environments might be impacting, and so too does the manager, and the even the board need to be clued into it, to its importance.
Yeah.
They may not need it as much because they're distanced from the vicarious trauma itself, but nonetheless, to be clued into it. Yeah.
And there's some stuff around, policy development and all of that are in those earlier slides. So have a look at those in terms of how that can be enacted throughout the organization. Yeah. And that's captured again, I think, in some of these points that we're making in the conclusion. Yeah. That we need to position vicarious trauma not just being about the individual, but it's a social and a community discourse that all people that engage with anybody else encounters, and that prevention, in as much as you can prevent, is more that to prevent the more negative impacts of vicarious trauma. We're not going to prevent vicarious trauma totally, but just being aware of it, being able to be proactive about it is really important. We thought, and targeting all staff, as we mentioned before. Yeah. And Gary has made that point a few times. Being able to identify, I think that's really important in terms of colleagues and for managers as well, to be watching out. Is there behavior changes? You mentioned anger there, Gary. Is something more angry than there would have been? Often these are signs. Sometimes we can
tired.
Yeah. But sometimes in work, if you say, oh God, she's always angry, that one, stay away from her, she's trouble, this staff member, to actually stop and think, you know what, don't dismiss this person as being difficult to work with or angry. That could be stemming so much from vicarious trauma and from being overwhelmed. And often I find that when you actually sit down and work with somebody, or you give them that compassion, rather than avoiding a difficult team member, that you discover that that person is maybe struggling. So I think it's really important to be aware of that.
It's really that awareness that it's in our, you know, when we're looking through what could all this be, that vicarious trauma is part of our thinking.
Yeah.
And then we're saying, because, you know, people are going to be impacted by the people who come into our services. You can't stop that happening, but you can reduce its impact. But we have to be thinking about it and strategizing for it in order to reduce its impact.
And I'm just actually thinking about vicarious trauma that comes from working with other staff as well, you know, where, you know, sometimes people do overload us with their, you know, kind of their interactions maybe with clients, and they have become really distressed, and you're supporting somebody else. So being aware of that, that we're in that.
I think given the time, we better stop there and just hand back. So as I say,
thank you.
This is available to you. The presentation is available. Over to you, Gráinne.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary and Briege. That was really, really informative and interesting. Just it was very engaging and great to hear about all of the tools and details there. We might just invite some questions there if anybody wants to put anything into the chat while we have Gary and Briege here. And I might just say myself, I suppose my experience is working with Housing First frontline practitioners, and self-care there really is about preserving, protecting and looking after yourself in that area. So I think it's important to call it out as well, to kind of say the staff at times are finding the work hard because the work is hard. And maybe you know, they're dealing with people that are in stress mode a lot of the time. But what kind of how do you know when you're burnt out, or what does that feel like?
I think a lot of, if you've got good self-awareness, you probably won't get burned out because you'll know about it and you'll be working with it. And if you are burned out, you probably don't know. And so you are really dependent on the people around you kind of giving you feedback. And that's where that team environment where it's okay to talk about the effect, like you're talking there about the real challenge of Housing First. Which is a brilliant intervention, a brilliant way of working with people, but really puts you at the front line of the daily trauma that people are experiencing. So as you know, as part of a vicarious trauma-informed organization, it's about realizing, well, that's normal that you would be impacted by that. And so therefore, how will we as teams manage it so that we can be talking things through, making sure it's not impacting, drawing attention to each other about how we see that impacting? Because obviously if somebody's coping with their day's work by going off to the pub and drinking, and maybe drinking excessively, or like me, eating far too much chocolate at times, or which may sound like not the same thing, but let's say at my age, I can't be doing that anymore. So it's really just about creating an environment where we can see it more clearly. By the time you're burned out, it really is that your negativity will be there. Maybe you're not sleeping very well, maybe you're having nightmares, maybe you are kind of having a really bad view of the world. Nothing changes, nothing is possible, we haven't achieved anything. So you begin to talk in that way. You very much will mirror maybe the people that you're working with, those who've experienced very serious trauma, and you're mirroring their behaviors. But again, if your awareness isn't switched on, you don't see it. So often other people around you will see it quicker.
Okay.
And also I think that whole thing of, you know, if you're waking up in the morning and or you're dreading going into work, or you feel you don't have that spark anymore, that you don't have that appetite or the joy or of going into work, or even something within your work day to look forward to or give you pleasure. If you're not feeling that, I think, you know, that for me is a big sign that you know, you're burnt out. If there's not one single thing that you can think of, I think that can be very telling.
Okay, we do have a question there, just which is asking, is there a guidance document available that would help HR to draw up guidelines to support staff who may be dealing with vicarious trauma, be it themselves or dealing with a colleague?
I don't know of one immediately to hand. What I find myself doing is talking to other organizations that are trauma aware and asking them how they have reflected that in their HR policies and documents. And some of the bigger organizations will have that in place already. So it's really about, and then, within the trauma-informed movement, you'll hear about the promotion of the trauma-informed champion. And so one of the things is that whenever you are reading any of policies from an organization, is really to be looking, how is this trauma-informed? Is this policy in keeping with what we understand as trauma-informed practice, and by extension, vicarious trauma-informed? So rather than saying there's a document that I can go to, I can't help you here, but somebody else watching might have some access to it. I would be saying, go through your documents, and as you're updating them and reading them, to be really looking with a trauma-informed lens.
Okay.
And is that reflected?
And also, I suppose I'd say some of the work that has been done on the psychologically informed environments as well, the PI stuff, is very useful, because that encapsulates the workers and the whole environment as well. So there's useful stuff in there in terms of that HR might find useful, apart from the client-facing stuff that goes, kind of more broad than that as well. So that might be a useful resource.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we might hand over to Bob Jordan, the Chief Executive of the Housing Agency, for concluding remarks, if that's okay, Bob.
Thanks, Grania. Listen, I want to thank everybody for joining us on the seminar today. I just want to take a few minutes, I suppose, just to wrap up this series of seminars and then look to what we might do next. Last November, the Housing Agency launched a series of webinars on trauma-informed care for housing practitioners. And with the hour-long seminars, we aim to contribute to the conversation on the impact of trauma and on how housing practitioners can adopt a trauma-informed approach. I suppose it's also important to say that, as has been said already, we're working in a sector that can be difficult at times. We need to look out for each other. And I suppose, in a way, this is the Housing Agency's contribution towards that. And I really want to thank Gary and Briege for their really enriching presentation today on self-care, or care of me, certainly a phrase I'll use far more often. And obviously we're delighted, and it's appropriate that Briege and Gary did finish out this series, because the whole series in a way was inspired by a talk that you gave in summer of 2021, which got great feedback on unhoused trauma in homelessness and addiction, still available on the Housing Agency website. And it's also pretty clear that you're a great double act. So thank you for today. Just to say, trauma-informed care is very closely linked to the Housing Agency's work in the area of social inclusion, which has grown very considerably in the last couple of years. As Grania has outlined, the Housing First National Office was established within the Housing Agency in 2022. We're very much involved in the implementation of the youth homelessness strategy. We've supported the development of the National Housing Strategy for Disabled People. And we've also been involved in supporting the Department of Integration with accommodation for Ukrainians and for international protection applicants. So we've an ongoing recognition of the effects of trauma and the need for trauma-informed environments. And with that, I just want to talk about maybe the next steps and where we go from here. And this is where we need your help. Like we know from this series, there's just been an incredible interest and thirst for knowledge on trauma-informed care. Along with today, about over 450 people have watched the live seminars, and over 750 have watched the 3 previous webinars on our YouTube channel. So that's a lot of people interested in trauma-informed care. And I suppose those figures really show the need for ongoing education and information and training on trauma-informed care. And I suppose we're committed to working with and supporting housing practitioners in this area. And this is where you can help us. We want you to tell us where you think this could go next. Is it more webinars, in-person workshops, or even an accredited course on trauma-informed care for housing practitioners? So we'll be issuing a survey to everyone who's registered for the webinars, and we'd love to hear from you. And we also plan to consult with all the expert speakers that have taken part, and really the next stage will be led by the feedback from you. And then finally, just some thank yous. Thank you to all the speakers for their time and preparation they put into these webinars. And so on your behalf, I'd like to thank Dr. Sharon Lambert and Dr. Marie Lottie from UCC, Eileen Gleeson, the former director of the DRHE and the Housing Agency board member, Alana Canton, a social care worker, Louisa Carr from Respond, Una Burns from Novas, and once again to thank Briege and Gary. I'd also like to thank the chairs of the webinars, Patrick McCarthy, Rob Louth and Grania Johnston from the Housing Agency. And I'd also like to thank the policy and practice team in the Housing Agency for setting up and organising the sessions, especially Graham Fryer and Rosalind Malloy. And just to let you all know, as it's been said already, all of these sessions will be available on the Housing Agency YouTube channel as a resource for the sector. And with that, I conclude today's webinar and just thank you for your attendance. Thank you.